Check this out. I have two type layers, and inside I have gradients on both of them. But if I select both of the layers and I come over here and do something like change my blending mode, notice how one of them acts differently than the other. The same would be true if I adjust things like fill. One will look quite different from the other. That's because you can always do things in different ways in Photoshop, and oftentimes there are hidden features lurking behind the scenes that you're not aware of that change the way Photoshop works. Let's take a look at why that's happening in this case. So I'm going to reconstruct this very quickly just so you can see how each one was done, and then we can see why they would be different. So I'm going to start with this top layer. What I'd like to do there is create a brand new empty layer on top of it, and I'll come over here and use my gradient tool. I'll click on the bottom of the edge of the text, and I'll drag straight up while holding shift to make sure I get a straight line until I get to the top of the text. That's going to give me my gradient. Then I can cause that layer that contains my gradient to only show up where the layer below contains information. I can either go up here to the layer menu and choose create clipping mask, or what I do more commonly to accomplish the same thing is to hold down the option key, alt key in Windows, and click on the line that divides two layers. It does the exact same thing. It takes the layer you're currently working on and clips it to the layer directly below. So wherever this layer is empty, this layer above will not show up. Well, that's one way I could get a gradient inside of text. But another method I could use would be to come down here to a different line of text, to come down to the bottom of my layers panel and choose FX. And that's where I would find gradient overlay. And I have this set up already to be the same color, so I'll just click OK. And that's the two ways that I put color inside of that text. But now if I grab both of those type layers, I'll just hold shift and get the other one, and I change the blending mode. Multiply mode should make it so all it can do is darken the image and it prints like ink. But notice it only affects that top version. Same with all the other blending modes. Then if I come down here and use fill and I lower it, you'll find again it only affects the top version. Why is the bottom version ignoring that? Well, that's because these were made in two different ways using two different sets of features, and if I were to go to one of these layers and come down here to the letters FX and choose blending options, each one of the layers has a different set of settings here, and you'll notice right here is a choice called blend clipped layers as group, and it's turned on by default. But then there's a setting above that and it says blend interior effects as group, and that defaults to be turning off. The only difference between those layers is these settings. If we change these settings, we'll end up changing what we get. So let me click cancel here. And first, let me take both of these type layers and put them into a blending mode. Let's use something like multiply, which should only darken. Then let's go back in and take a look at those settings to see how things work. I'll work with this layer, which is the top one, and I'll go to the letters FX at the bottom of my layers panel and choose blending options. By the way, there's another way to get to that if you double click not on the name of the layer, but out here in the empty space. That also brings you into the same screen. Alright, so right up here it also indicates we're in multiply mode because that's just a copy of the opacity and blending mode that's found at the top of the layers panel. But now what we did in this particular case is we took this top layer, which contains a gradient, and we clipped it. That's what this little down pointing arrow means. We clipped it to this layer. And down here is a choice. It says blend clipped layers as group. Well, what the heck does that mean? Well, that means anything that is clipped together like this will be completed first before it considers the blending mode that's being used to allow this stuff to blend in with what's underneath. So it's saying let's act as if we merge these two layers together before we apply multiply mode. Now if I turn that checkbox off, then the top version of the text would act just like the bottom one, because now it's not going to combine them together first. Instead, what's going to happen is only the layer that's set to multiply mode, which is this text, is going to multiply or print like ink, and this layer up here will not do the same thing. It's just going to appear as normal. It's not going to take on the blending mode that is happening down here. So anyway, I've changed that. Let's click OK, and now let's see if we can get the bottom one to act like the top one used to. Well, here, if you look at how I applied the gradient, it was with a gradient overlay layer effect. Remember the word effect in that case. With that text layer active, let's go back down here to the letters FX. Let's choose blending options. And in this case, you see the word effects on this top one. It says blend interior effects as group. What does it mean by interior? That means any one of these layer styles or layer effects that would happen right on top of the text itself and would not extend beyond its edge. There are things in here that would extend beyond the edge of the text. Those would be things like a drop shadow, an outer glow, and some of the bevel and emboss settings. Those things are not considered interior effects, so they wouldn't be affected by this. But anything that would cover up the original contents of that layer, those would be things like a pattern overlay, gradient overlay, color overlay, satin, inner glow, inner shadow, those kinds of settings. Those are all interior effects because they happen on the inside edge of that layer. So let's turn on blend interior effects as group. We're in multiply mode with that type layer, so when we blend them as a group, it's going to apply what we have on this layer, which is a gradient overlay, and it's going to act as if you made that permanent. You merged it together before it applies the blending mode. If we have that turned off, then it's applying multiply mode to the text, and then after it does that, it's applying that layer style or layer effect on top of it and not considering that it was in this blending mode. So just remember the difference between a clipped layer. That's where you see that little down pointing arrow, meaning that this layer only shows up where the layer below has contents. That would be a clipped layer. And if this checkbox is turned on, it's going to act as if these two pieces have been merged together before it considers the blending mode and the fill setting. But this particular layer, that's the lower version, doesn't have anything clipped to it, so that's not going to affect anything. Let's click OK, and let's come up here and just work with something other than this gradient. What I'm going to do is just select all and hit the delete key so that layer becomes empty, and then I can paint on it later. This, which is underneath, is our text. It's in multiply mode. That's why it's printing like it is. It's acting as if we're using ink and printing a very light whitish yellow on the image. Now, let's make sure that if I go down here to the letters FX and I choose blending options, that we've taken this checkbox that says blend clipped layers as group and we've turned it off, because that now is no longer the default setting. I'll click OK. This layer is in multiply mode, and this layer up here contains nothing. I'm going to grab my paintbrush tool, and let's bring maybe our opacity down to maybe 40 or 50%, and I'm going to paint with the same color as the text. And I'm just going to paint in here. When I do, remember this is clipped to the text, so when I paint like this, it can only show up where the text is. Well, notice that whatever I'm putting in that layer is no longer combining with the text that's underneath before it gets applied in multiply mode. Multiply mode would only be able to darken the image. Now we're able to brighten it. So I could come in here and create a kind of interesting looking type effect, because I'm able to make it so this layer is not combining with that before it goes into multiply mode. Let's set it back. If I come back here to the text and I just double click to the right, and I can just come in here and say blend clip layers as group. If I do that, it's not going to combine the way that I want it to. Now it's acting as if these two layers are merged together and they contain the same colors. And therefore you can't even tell that this is here, because all it's doing is adding more of the exact same color to the text. But if I turn off my blend clip layers as group, then I can get the effect that I want. Now, anytime you change the default settings that are in here on a layer, you're going to find an icon on the right side of the layer. It looks like this one. And you can also double click on that icon to come in here and see the settings. If I turn that back on, then you see that icon goes away to indicate we don't have any weird settings in here being applied. But I'll click cancel. Now I have another type layer down here. Let's turn that one on, and I want to add an effect to it. The effect I'm going to use is an interior effect, meaning it's going to cover up where the text would originally be. And what I'm going to use in this case is a pattern overlay. What I'd like to do is just have it so my text is striped. And I like that. But I want that to not have the white areas showing up. In order to make it not have the white areas, I'm going to use a blending mode. If I tell it to print this as if it was ink, that would be multiply mode. How do you print white? Well, you leave the paper alone, and that means it would leave the image that's behind alone when I end up using multiply mode. But if I change this to multiply mode, this is not the same as changing the layer to that. Because right now I'm in the settings for my pattern overlay. And this blending mode controls how that effect is going to affect the contents of this layer. So when I choose multiply, you can see that now it prints on top of the text that way, but that's not what I was looking for. I was looking to have it do that to the photograph. So I'm going to set this back to normal, and instead let's go back to that screen we were in with those special settings. You can get to it right up here at the top where it says blending options. That's where we were every time we were in there. Just click there. But if I come up here and I think about changing the blending mode, I really should consider the settings that are down here. Think about how those little stripes are being applied to my text. If I move this out of the way, you can see they are effects. And so if I look in this list for things that has the word effects in it, it says blend interior effects as group. It's turned off. And so right now, if I change the blending mode of this layer, that will take the original contents of that layer, which was red text, and make it print on top of the image that's underneath as if it was made out of ink, but the stripes that are in there will ignore this. So when I set it to multiply, I don't notice anything happen. Well, something happened behind the scenes, like underneath this. There's red text printing on top of this background. But what I want to do is blend our interior effects as a group, which means act as if those stripes are merged with the original contents of the layer before considering this. So now if I turn that on, I'm getting the stripes that I desire because they're printing with multiply mode onto the image that is underneath. It's only because I've blended my interior effects as a group. So when thinking about these two settings, you can somewhat imagine that they were worded differently. And imagine that instead of saying blend, it means merge. So merge effects, and then it would be before blending mode. That's in general what these two things mean, and it all depends on how you applied things, if you clipped it or if you used a layer effect. So the only reason those two layers acted differently was because of a setting that's kind of hidden behind the scenes in Photoshop, and it just happens to be that somebody at Adobe decided, hey, let's have different settings for both kinds of effects. If we clip something to a layer, let's default that to acting as if those layers get merged together before applying the blending mode. That's because its little checkbox is turned on. But when it comes to layer effects, let's not make that work the same. All it is they chose to make the default setting turned off when it comes to effects. Well, you can change it so it ends up working the way you would like, and now hopefully you get more control over any time you clip something to a layer or you use layer effects. I'm Ben Wilmore, and here are a few more videos you might enjoy about Photoshop.